Welcome everyone to Mailfuzz TV. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about Station 11, Episode 3. It's called Hurricane. So spoilers for the episode as always. And this is a very different episode again. I don't think I was expecting to. I mean, I'm not surprised we got this episode. Like this episode, which is the story of Miranda and the actor Arthur Leander and their relationship and sort of the just kind of like more about the creation of the comic in general. And there might even be more to tell, to be honest, potentially. But this is something I would have expected later in the season. I think because we had the first episode, which was very different to what the main part of the show was going to be. Once we got the traveling acting troupe last episode, I thought we were going to be sticking with that for a while. I was very surprised that we got an episode here where we don't see any of those characters at all. It is an episode told over two parts of the timeline, but it's the first few years of when Miranda meets Arthur and building up to how they eventually separate. And then it's back to the day the world fell apart, but this time from Miranda's perspective and what she was doing, which is being in Malaysia doing this business presentation because she's in logistics, as we find out. The opening scene shows her going for her job interview, and we get this kind of entertaining scene with this character, her boss, who's interviewing her for the job. He basically starts talking about logistics like it's like he's a scientist in like a sci-fi movie trying to explain going through a wormhole. He's talking about how he's got two pens and he's explaining how you get from one place to the other place, but not from a straight line. You got to go through, and it's all around you, and it's all it doesn't make the most amount of sense I've ever heard. But what's interesting about it though is that in the not present day, but the in the later part of the timeline, right, when we're in Malaysia following her, and she's trying to do this presentation, and the world starts to fall apart, and she ends up being on the phone a couple of times to this character, her boss, who is trying to help her get out of the country. He's like, hey, there's this boat that's ready to take you to this big ship, and you'll be on that big ship for at least a year. The idea being that it'll keep people isolated away from everyone else in the mainlands, and you'll have a better chance of surviving because of that. I think this opening scene with him being such a colorful character and so enthusiastic, and he's smiling a lot, and he's doing this big demonstration with the pens, is that it added a bit of weight later on in the episode when he's on the phone and he's showing concern and he's coughing, implying that he's already dying, and that he's basically trying to, with his dying few hours or days, save someone that he perhaps has come to care about, like, or at the very least he cares about her in a like, oh, this is an innocent person, I'm going to try and like help her out before I die. So it's actually kind of touching when she ultimately ends up lying to him and says she's on the boat. She isn't. She dropped the keys when she found out Arthur was dead. She dropped the keys and had this whole like sort of panic attack moment. She never made it to the boat, but she lies to him. She's sitting in the hotel room at the end of the episode, and she lies and says she's there just to comfort this man so that he can die thinking that he saved her. I thought that had some weight to it because it spent time to let us see him. Because you could have just not seen him. You could have just had these phone calls and it would have been okay. Like that moment where she lies to him would have still worked to a point. But I think having seen him be just a nice guy at the start of the episode gave it a bit more weight than it would have done otherwise. So I thought that was smart. And I think the other part in Malaysia for her story, other than this other guy that she's there with who doesn't believe that anything's really happening, he's got his golf clubs, he's ready to just wait it out, he thinks it'll all be over. It's not until she breaks down at the presentation, and this is after she's already tried to leave, where she just breaks down about Arthur dying, about them all being screwed or whatever, where she actually kind of opens up to this guy a little bit and gives him a hug, and it's a really awkward hug. But I think a big part of this story in this episode is that she, as a character, is a very closed-off person. She's not someone who has let people into her life in an intimate way, and she's kind of shut people out. So it's kind of a big deal that she is showing this sympathy for someone else openly by giving this guy a hug and, you know, lying to her boss to give him some comfort before he dies. It does feel like this is kind of showing like how she's come since the earlier parts of the story where we see her life, and that's probably greatly shown with the Station 11 comic book itself, in that in the entire backstory of this episode, we see that she is a very secretive person. She does not let people see her work. She doesn't want anyone to even read it when it's finished. That's something that comes up a few times. And at the end of the episode, she opens the door. The final moment of the episode is her seeing the astronaut. And I kind of read this based on this episode as her retreating to her shell, her like sort of protective shell that keeps her safe and comfortable from the outside world. And it's something that she's maybe unhealthily had throughout her whole life, but here in this darkest of days might actually be the coping mechanism that lets her survive, at least mentally, in some way. And it does make me think that the astronaut at the end of episode 1, when we get a quick glimpse of him, it does suggest to me that that wasn't a literal shot and it was more metaphorical, but maybe does imply that Miranda is alive out there. I mean, because he was like on a space station, I think, if I remember correctly, at the end of episode 1. So maybe that represents that she did somehow make it to a boat, that she is somehow in the world somewhere, but cut off and separate from the rest of civilization or something. I'm reading into that too much, but I was thinking that as we were seeing this stuff towards the end. But this episode very much is about how she is closed off as a person, and to sort of like, go back and make that full circle, the evidence for that for me of what this astronaut represents to her is very much told through the first time she meets Arthur Leander, where he tries to get to know her. He sort of inserts himself into her life by talking to her, trying to buy a piece of her art. She was drawing the astronaut at this diner, and she ends up giving him a random drawing of a banana instead. But she doesn't really like that he's seen it, says that he doesn't understand it, or like why would she give it to anyone, because it's not like you know what it is. And he actually makes an attempt at analyzing her art and talks about how, oh, it's this person who's alone, and they're not necessarily sad, but they are alone, and this suits for protection because it keeps everyone else away from them. It keeps the harm away from them. So I think first of all, he's basically describing her, right? Without him realizing that, maybe he's describing her. He's analyzing Miranda. But I think it also gives us a sense of what the astronaut represents to her. And I think that's what the end of the episode is doing by having her retreat to the astronaut. It's her retreating to her place of safety. But she does show a lot of growth in this episode, because I think the fact that she even has, multiple copies of the book, we find out, like we sort of revisit that scene from episode 1 where she comes to see Arthur, and now we have a much better context for it. Now we know that their marriage fell apart, and part of it was her being so closed off, and the idea that she was never going to show anyone this piece of work. We have the dinner party scene where she says, no, I'm never even going to show it to anyone, never mind publish it, it's just for me. But it kind of becomes this representation of how she is with the marriage, where she doesn't let him in. She doesn't let him into her life. It's very cold and distant, and that leads to a bunch of things. So I think her choosing to come to him right before the outbreak and giving him a finished copy, it does almost feel like kind of like a... Not make good feels like a bit of too much of a simple term, but the idea being that even though he's moved on and he's got a wife and he's got kids and they're not going to get back together or anything like that, I think it's meant to be her having some growth and saying, I understand why things fell apart. So on some level, I do think you should read this. You should read this piece of me that I was withholding all that time. It does feel like in some way it's a very therapeutic way for her to get some kind of closure. And it's kind of a big moment where she says, oh yeah, here's a second copy to send to your son, because he said that the son would like it. So she's like, hey, here's a second one. And there's more where that came from. So that does answer some questions I had in the last episode, because, Kirsten believed she had the only copy. Turns out there was at least more than one. So maybe whether or not Arthur's son having a copy is what's directly led down to this cult-like following of the words in the book, I don't know. But either way, there's more copies out there. So that felt like a big bit of growth for the character, for her to be willing to show Arthur this book. But even the idea that she's already made multiple copies feels like she has at least recognized like some of her own issues, and she is trying to overcome them. And sharing this art, this piece of her private self, is a way of doing that. But this is not to gloss over a lot of the backstory here of the actual relationship. and the dinner party scene especially, because there's a lot of stuff in here to kind of mull over. Because I think it would be very easy to present Arthur as villainous to the audience because he ends up having an affair, and I don't think it completely absolves him. No one's going to root for someone committing adultery, but I think it presents you with a very empathetic story with him on it, because you get that he feels like his wife is distant. It feels that even when they get married, it's presented in a way where it was of convenience because it's good, because he's a famous actor. She'll be treated better if she's actually a wife. And I even got the impression that he's not just like saying that to his publicist or whoever he's talking to on the phone. I also got the impression that maybe that's how he even sold it to her. That Miranda is so closed off. Like every step of this relationship, he has to kind of like talk her into and encourage her to take the next step. She's always saying, "Oh, I need to go," and he says like, why? Why'd you have to go? And they end up having sex, and then even after they have sex, she's like, "Oh, I should go," and he has to talk her into like staying in bed for a little bit and staying intimate. She's always closed off. She's always trying to sort of get away from actually being in the relationship in a way, and it feels like that just carries on throughout everything, to the point where even when they get married and they're living together, she spends all of her time in the pool house doing her art for her comic, and she doesn't let anyone see it. She's closed off, and he brings this up. It's a genuine concern that he has, that the marriage is like he's feeling unfulfilled. So when it comes out he's having an affair, well, yeah, it's not the greatest thing in the world. You don't necessarily like look at him and go, "Oh, you're just a monster." You weren't just looking for like a fling. You weren't just looking for some sex. Because this woman that he ends up having an affair with, it sounds like, he got married to her. He had kids with her. He did want a long-term relationship. He was just not getting that from the marriage that he was in. He was getting kind of the cold shoulder, effectively. And I think Miranda, in some level, is being reflective about that when she chooses to give him a copy of this book to try and give some closure to their marriage and how it fell apart. Or something like that. That was kind of like the way I was reading some of these scenes. It was this character who's went through this change and growth, and that's what made me think there might even be some more story to tell in here between the end of the marriage and her finishing the book. I could see there being something else in there to tell about how she goes through this change. Maybe not, maybe we won't, but I think the window's there for it if they want to tell more of that story. Yeah, I mean, the dinner party scene itself, there's a lot of smart little things here, particularly I think the idea that she quotes his bad movie, and because we've heard him throughout the episode make fun of his own movies. He says he doesn't like movies. He jokes about the crappy action movies that he's in, and I think that's kind of interesting that he is an actor and his quote unquote art is out there for the world to see, and he kind of disregards it and he kind of makes fun of it. Whereas her art, her comic book, is something that's very private. It's just for her, and she clearly very much cares for it in a way that he doesn't care for his films, at least not anymore. Maybe he did once upon a time. The backstory for him and his friend, his Irish friend Clark, who's another actor, they talk about being Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, in plays back when they were acting students and stuff like that, and they're quite fond of those memories. So maybe at one point in the world or in their life, he was quite proud of his work, and he did care about his art in a way. But this is, different, right? This is like she keeps it to herself. She doesn't want it to lose that specialness that it's just for her. And maybe opening up her art to people is also opening herself up to people where they'll see her insecurities, and she doesn't want that. So I do think it's an interesting comparison between both of their art, if you will, like his acting and how it's just kind of this bill-paying job effectively at this point. It's all just kind of, and he doesn't come across as a completely shallow, cynical character. He comes across as someone who wants the meaning in life to come from his personal life. He wants a marriage. He wants to care about that side of life. And the acting has become just the job, where Miranda's kind of caught in this place where she's putting all of the meaning into the art that she's not letting anyone else seeing because she's so closed off, but is sort of not letting the other things flourish because of that. And I think, in the Malaysia part of the story, she does like feel regret about that she didn't stay with Arthur, because Arthur said, "Hey, why don't you come and see the play? We can get some dinner or something afterwards." to catch up. And she says, oh, she can't because she has to go to Malaysia, but she clearly regrets that choice. She wishes she'd stayed there with him. So I think the image you get of this marriage by the end of its story is that it's just kind of a tragic story where no one is completely a villain. Like, you can understand that he felt unfulfilled in this relationship and he kept trying to bring her out of her shell and it never quite happened. I think anyone who's ever been in a relationship that's felt kind of one-sided, like the other person's distant, can probably in some level sympathize with that with Arthur. Obviously, there's other ways he should have went about doing this, but ultimately you can sort of empathize with the decisions that he's made, regardless of how he's got there. And I think with Miranda, you can like understand why she feels violated. I think one of the biggest moments of the episode is when this other actress, I think her name is Elizabeth, the one he's having the affair with, she mentions having seen the drawings, her comic book in the pool house. She mentions that she's been in there and she's doing it to be nice. Like, she says, oh, your work's great, you should show it to people, it's fantastic. But the scene up until that point at the other end of the dinner table has been Miranda telling the others that she's not showing anyone her work and that she's probably not going to even release it because it's just for her. So not only do we, the audience, understand that Arthur has crossed a line by letting this woman into that private room to see her work, which kind of symbolizes the idea that he's let her into his life in an intimate way that he shouldn't have. But the other people at the dinner table, the other characters, know that this has crossed a line because everything that Miranda has just said to them at the other end of the table has set up for this being a big thing. That this is set up, that this is an intimate space that has been invaded that she is going to have a problem with. And that leads her to making the monologue from one of Arthur's movies. And it's almost like she's kind of taunting Arthur by saying, this is the crap that you don't care about in your art, but I do care about mine. And a line has been crossed here, kind of thing. Like, that was kind of like how I was reading that interaction. But I feel like there's enough meat there that you probably could read it in a couple of different ways. But I did kind of feel like it was her poking at his career and poking at the art for him that has no meaning, but hers does have meaning. And I think that's really what she was kind of getting at there. So, and that's, the night she leaves. And, clearly a big theme of this show so far seems to be what art means to people and what it is for them. And for Miranda, it's this safety blanket. It's this kind of like block against the rest of the world that she's trying to like hold up. Obviously, the fact that we have an acting troupe in the post-apocalyptic world trying to like use it to kind of like keep civilization alive and keep happiness alive in some way. Maybe the idea that Arthur eventually stopped doing movies and started doing Broadway is even like a something that was influenced by Miranda, even if he doesn't realize it, that he's trying to reconnect with the art in the way that he actually cared about initially, as opposed to these soulless movies that he's seemingly doing, for a paycheck. Maybe these connections we have to art and how it keeps us going is a big part of what this show is trying to do. I will say, I want to confess something here, because I've got the IMDb page up here for this episode. I think I've seen a spoiler on the IMDb page, because they've listed a character's name, which I don't think I was supposed to know yet. But clearly they've backdated it into the other episodes from whenever it gets revealed. So I have a bit of a spoiler, unfortunately. But hey, it's fine. We'll survive. But I won't say what it is, just for people watching the reviews who might be working through the show alongside. I won't spoil it, but I think I've seen a spoiler. So hopefully it's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. That's my thoughts on episode 3 of Station 11. So thank you very much to Alison once again for sponsoring this review and picking the show. I will see you guys again in a couple of weeks for the next episode. So thank you very much for joining me. I do appreciate it. I wouldn't be able to do this without all the support on Patreon. I wouldn't be able to do all the reviews I do every week between the TV channel and the movie channel. So whether you're on Patreon or a YouTube member or whatever else, thank you for the support. Like, subscribing, all that stuff helps out too. So thank you very much. I'll see you guys next time. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?